The story of Frank Richards isn't just about muscles, titles, or trophies. It's the story of a man who lived bodybuilding in every possible phase, from the early dream to glory, from tragedy to an unlikely comeback. From a young age, Richards made it clear he wasn't meant to be just another name in the sport, but someone who would leave a lasting mark on the history of bodybuilding. Throughout the video, we follow a journey defined by natural talent and an incredible work ethic. Frank didn't rise by accident. Every achievement was built through discipline, sacrifice, and a genuine love for lifting weights. But like every great story, his path wasn't a straight line. Just when everything pointed to him reaching his ultimate peak, life threw obstacles his way that very few people could have handled. Frank Richards' story begins long before bright stage lights and major international competitions. In England during the 1960s, Frank was simply a student who stood out in physical education classes. Even early on, his talent caught attention, especially in sprinting events, where he showed explosive power, sharp focus, and above-average competitiveness. At that time, track and field was his main goal. Frank devoted himself to short-distance sprints and hurdles, training with seriousness and ambition. He wasn't running just for fun. He wanted to win, cut his times, and push past his limits. The turning point came thanks to a coach who was ahead of his time. Unlike most trainers back then, he believed strength and power were essential for a great sprinter. He introduced Frank to weight training, resistance work, and even methods that were considered unconventional for that era. This wasn't just training, it was a revelation. That's when Frank had his first real contact with weightlifting. He later described this phase as his baptism into bodybuilding. The feeling of lifting iron, sensing the muscles respond, and watching his body change sparked something deep inside him. It wasn't just about athletic performance anymore. It was about identity. From that moment on, everything changed. The discipline, the growing strength, and the control over his own body ignited a passion that never faded. During his teenage years, Frank Richards had no more doubts. Bodybuilding wasn't just a complement to athletics. It was the path he wanted to follow. The sensations awakened by weight training went far beyond the physical. It had become a purpose. Even at a young age, Frank understood he wanted to build something serious within the sport. At first, he trained at a local youth club, one of the few places in the area that offered basic weight equipment. There, Frank began developing his physique consistently, learning through hands-on experience, watching other athletes, and testing his own limits. Progress was happening, but something still felt missing. Despite the physical improvements, Frank sensed that the environment wasn't pushing him forward. It lacked energy, challenge, inspiration. He didn't just want to lift weights. He wanted to breathe bodybuilding, to feel like he was part of something bigger. That's when, almost by chance, he heard about an unusual place, Cat's Gym. It wasn't a traditional gym, but a converted barn on a farm. To most people, it would have looked improvised. To Frank, it was a revelation. The moment he walked in, he felt that the place had a soul. At Cat's Gym, Frank found much more than barbells and dumbbells. He found people, stories, community, and identity. That's where bodybuilding stopped being just training and became a lifestyle. It was inside Cat's Gym that Frank Richards met the person who would completely change the way he viewed bodybuilding. There, he met Harry Catterall, the gym's owner and a true lover of the sport. More than a coach, Harry became a guide, someone who believed in Frank's potential from day one. Under this mentorship, Frank trained for free, receiving detailed technical guidance and, more importantly, constant emotional support. Harry didn't just teach exercises, he taught posture, patience, and respect for the process. During this period, Frank learned one of the most important lessons of his life. Bodybuilding is never a closed path. Techniques evolve, bodies change, knowledge keeps moving forward. The moment you think you already know everything is the moment you stop growing. From that point on, he adopted a clear philosophy. Listen more, always keep learning, and never underestimate other people's experience. In a sport where ego can easily take over, Frank chose humility as his edge. That didn't make him weaker, it made him more prepared. With the solid foundation built at Cat's Gym, Frank Richards takes the natural next step, officially entering the competitive scene. National contests become his first real test, and it quickly becomes obvious that he wasn't just another athlete trying his luck. Frank stepped on stage with confidence, control, and a presence that demanded attention. Results started to come, especially in competitions organized by NABA. Frank earned major podium finishes at the Mr. Universe, going head-to-head with seasoned competitors and truly impressive physiques. Every contest served as a lesson, but also as confirmation that he belonged at that level. It didn't take long for titles to follow. Frank claimed championships like Mr. Britain and Mr. World, firmly placing his name among the top bodybuilders of his era. These wins weren't just trophies, they were passports to something bigger. His refined aesthetics, balanced symmetry, and confident stage posture made him stand out even in extremely competitive lineups. Frank didn't rely on size alone. His physique told a visual story that judges and fans could instantly recognize, and that made all the difference. At that point, one truth became unavoidable. If Frank Richards wanted to reach the absolute top of bodybuilding, he would have to cross the ocean. As Frank Richards rose through the competitive ranks, something around him began to change. He was no longer surrounded only by local athletes or rising prospects. He was now training alongside the biggest names of bodybuilding's so-called golden era. During this period, Frank trained and built close bonds with athletes like Franco Columbu and Frank Zane. Each had a different style, but all were united by the same obsession with excellence. These training sessions weren't just physical. They were exchanges of mindset, vision, and experience that pushed Frank to an even higher level. But one connection, in particular, would leave a lasting mark on his journey. While spending time in London, Frank developed a close friendship with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It wasn't just mutual admiration. There was real respect, daily interaction, and long conversations about ambition, the future, and even dreams beyond the sport. Two driven young men, each in his own way, planning to conquer the world. These encounters elevated Frank to a new status. He was no longer seen simply as a great British bodybuilder, but as part of a select group of athletes who would go on to shape the history of the sport. At what seemed like a casual dinner, Frank Richards' path took a decisive turn. Alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger, he met Joe Weider in person, the most powerful figure in bodybuilding at the time. Between conversations about training, competitions, and the future, a proposal emerged that very few athletes would ever receive. Joe Weider saw something special in Frank and made a direct offer: move to the United States and work with him. It wasn't just a chance to compete. It was an invitation into the very heart of professional bodybuilding. For Frank, that offer represented everything he had been chasing since his earliest training days back in England. Without hesitation, Frank accepted. He moved to New York and began living with Arnold, entering an intense and almost surreal routine. The two trained together every day, pushed each other, stayed motivated, and shared big visions for the future. It wasn't just weight training. It was an environment where dreams were taken seriously. At night, they talked about ambitions that went far beyond the stage. Arnold spoke about movies and politics, while Frank absorbed that larger-than-life mindset. Being so close to someone with that kind of vision expanded his own horizons even further. Despite fully living the peak of American bodybuilding, Frank Richards slowly began to feel a quiet weight building over time. The distance from family, friends, and his roots in the United Kingdom started to take a serious emotional toll. As grand as the US stage was, something was missing: a sense of belonging. Driven by that inner pull, Frank decided to return to England for a defining moment in his career: the 1970 NABA Mr. Universe. Expectations were sky-high. He wasn't coming back as just another promising athlete, but as someone who had trained and lived among the elite of world bodybuilding. Everyone wanted to see if that experience would truly show on stage. And he did. Frank won his division, Class 1, convincingly, showing physical maturity, control, and commanding stage presence. The overall title, however, slipped away in an almost cruel way by just one single vote. A razor-thin margin, the kind that stays burned into an athlete's memory forever. Even without the absolute title, that moment became one of the biggest milestones of his career up to that point. Frank proved to himself, and to the world, that he could compete at the very highest level, no matter the country or the stage. He didn't come back home smaller, he came back bigger. From there on, his focus shifted fully toward the IFBB professional scene. The goal was now crystal clear: face the best bodybuilders on the most demanding stages in the sport. Just as Frank Richards' career seemed ready to take its next massive leap, life delivered a brutal shock. While working his job at British Rail, Frank suffered a devastating accident, the kind that changes everything in a matter of seconds. An ordinary day suddenly turned into the most dramatic chapter of his entire life. The fall onto the tracks led to catastrophic consequences. Frank suffered multiple fractures, nearly lost his foot, and punctured a lung. This wasn't just a sports injury. It was a real, life-threatening situation. For an athlete whose body was his main tool, the future suddenly looked impossible. The impact of the accident went far beyond the physical. Frank was forced to step away from bodybuilding completely for 11 long years. Total silence replaced training sessions, stages, and dreams. While the bodybuilding world kept evolving, he was fighting just to recover and relearn how to live. During that time, many believed his career was permanently over. After all, very few athletes ever come back from severe injuries, and almost none return after more than a decade away. Slowly, the name Frank Richards began to feel like a memory rather than a present force. This marked the darkest point of his entire journey. Everything he had built seemed to have been taken away in an instant. After more than a decade on the sidelines, when almost everyone had accepted that the story was finished, Frank Richards made a quiet but monumental decision. In 1984, against all expectations, he chose to train again. There were no spotlights, no promises, no grand plans. Just a deep desire to reconnect with what had always defined his life. The starting point was humble. Frank returned to training weighing around 200 pounds, roughly 91 kilograms, far below the physique he once displayed on international stages. For many, that number would have been discouraging. For him, it was simply the beginning. His body was different, but his mindset was untouched. And then something almost magical happened. Muscle memory kicked in. Week after week, his muscles began to fill out again, strength returned, and his body responded as if it had never forgotten what to do. Within just a few months, Frank was displaying a physique that surprised even the most optimistic observers. The impact of his return went beyond the physical. As his presence started to be noticed at local events, reactions were immediate. People who had followed his career years earlier couldn't believe what they were seeing. The athlete many had written off was back, alive, strong, and competitive. The local bodybuilding scene was shaken. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a symbol of human resilience. Frank Richards' return still seemed low-key, until an unexpected moment changed everything. Almost against his own will, he was urged to make a simple appearance at a local event. He wasn't there to compete or prove anything. But the moment he stepped on stage, something extraordinary happened. As soon as the crowd realized who was standing in front of them, the reaction was instant. This wasn't just a bodybuilder returning after years away. This was a man who had faced the impossible and survived. Within seconds, the audience began chanting in unison, "Richards the Lionheart." A spontaneous roar, filled with admiration and respect. The nickname was born right there, naturally, and it spread fast. Lionheart didn't just stand for physical courage, but for mental strength, persistence, and an unbreakable spirit. It was public recognition that Frank had beaten something far greater than opponents on stage. He had beaten his own destiny. The moment was deeply emotional. Family members, friends, and training partners were overwhelmed as they realized the weight of that scene. Many were in tears. It wasn't just pride. It was relief, gratitude, and the certainty that all the suffering hadn't been for nothing. That reception validated years of silence and pain. In that instant, the legend of overcoming adversity was officially born. When Frank Richards' name started circulating again on the international scene, something almost unthinkable happened. He received an invitation to compete at the 1985 Mr. Olympia in Brussels. For most athletes, that alone would be the peak of an entire career. For Frank, it was proof that his comeback was real, legitimate, and fully respected. At 40 years old, he stepped on stage alongside some of the greatest names in bodybuilding history. Younger men, in their prime, representing the absolute highest level of the sport. The context made it even more impressive. Just a few years earlier, Frank had been fighting simply to recover physically. Now, he was standing on the most important stage in the world. He finished in 10th place, a number that, by itself, doesn't tell the full story. After more than a decade away, multiple severe injuries, and an almost impossible return. Placing among the top 10 in the world was extraordinary. For Frank, that ranking didn't feel like defeat. It felt like total victory. At that moment, the trophy wasn't the main goal. Just being there, under those lights, in front of that crowd, meant he had already won. He had beaten time, pain, limitations, and negative expectations. It was the realization of a dream he had never abandoned. The 1985 Mr. Olympia became the ultimate symbol of his entire journey. Not long after fulfilling the dream of stepping onto the Mr. Olympia stage, Frank Richards faced yet another unexpected blow from life. In an incident he had nothing to do with, Frank was stabbed during a disturbance at a restaurant. It wasn't a sports injury, not part of the risks of competition, just another tragedy completely outside his control. This new episode left deep scars, both physical and emotional. With pain and maturity, Frank realized his body had already been pushed beyond its limits. After so many battles, this was the hard confirmation he didn't want to accept. His competitive career, this time, was truly over. For many athletes, that would have been the definitive end. The moment when the sport loses its meaning without competitions, trophies, or spotlights. But Frank Richards was never driven by titles alone. Bodybuilding had always been bigger than the stage. Even far from official competitions, his love for lifting never faded. He kept training, not to beat other men, but to beat himself every single day. Training became therapy, identity, and a connection to everything he had built throughout his life. Back in England, Frank Richards returned to the place where it all began, Cat's Gym. Now, the atmosphere was different. The pressure of competition was gone, replaced by something just as powerful: the freedom to train for pure enjoyment, for health, and for the connection to the sport that had shaped his entire life. In this new chapter, Frank began regularly taking part in seminars across both the UK and the United States. He no longer stepped on stage to be judged, but to speak, teach, and share. Every seminar became a living lesson in history, discipline, and resilience, told by someone who had truly lived every part of it. Young athletes approached him looking for guidance, while veterans listened with respect. Frank didn't just talk about training or dieting. He talked about choices, mistakes, resilience, and mindset. His life story gave weight to every word. This wasn't theory, it was real experience. Over time, he became a deeply respected figure within the bodybuilding world, not just because of the titles he won or the physique he built, but because of his attitude, humility, and genuine willingness to help. Frank always made a point of listening, advising, and encouraging others, with honesty and empathy. Frank Richards' story delivers a clear lesson from the very first minute. True passion will take someone much further than raw talent ever could. His career wasn't the smoothest or the easiest, but it had something rare: an unshakable love for bodybuilding, strong enough to survive decades, pain, and loss. His journey reminds us that some stories aren't meant to be watched passively. They're meant to challenge us. To challenge our excuses, our self-imposed limits, and how easily we give up when the road gets hard. Frank fell more than once, lost years, lost the stage, but he never lost who he was. And that may be the greatest victory of all. If this story touched you in any way, if at some point you thought, "This speaks to me too," hit that like button right now. That simple action helps this video reach more people who also need to hear real stories of resilience. No fantasy, no shortcuts. Every like helps keep this kind of content alive on the channel. And don't forget to subscribe. If you want to go even further, consider becoming a channel member. You'll be directly supporting this work and helping ensure that more deep, human, and inspiring stories like this continue to be told.